everybody, it's Kelly from Let's Get Clacking, and in today's video we're going to go over test cuts. Now, there are probably a lot of people that have gotten cameos for Christmas that need to learn how to use them on vinyl. One of the easiest ways to find out how exactly your cameo can get that perfect cut is by doing test cuts. There's no use in wasting a crazy amount of vinyl because your cut isn't correct and you can't actually weed it properly. We've all been there, trust me, don't worry, it happens. But with this foolproof method that I'm going to go over today, we will get you on exactly the right path to get your test cuts perfect every time. Well, let's get clacking. Within the send panel of Silhouette, you can use the test cut feature. However, this always tests in the same place unless you manually move the blade on the Cameo. But the way that I'm going to show you today is a different way. So what I like to do is to use a block or a design or something, something very small that we can actually move around on the page to use as our test cut. So for this tutorial, I'm actually going to use the letter P because it has straights, it's got corners, it's got round parts, and it's got a lot of elements that could potentially go wrong with normal cuts. So the letter P is a very good letter to use. So we're going to start out with quite a small one because we don't need it to be very big. Let's start with, just over 1 centimeter. And then I'm going to take a box and I'm going to put a box around it. So very much like the Silhouette test cut where they have a triangle with a square around that, I'm just going to use the P with the box around that. So I'm going to group these objects, make sure that they are within the cut lines. Yes, they are. And then we go to the send panel. When it comes to the Silhouette cut settings, there are a few different things that you would need to take a look at. The first one is the blade depth, and that will show you on a scale from 1 to 10. So that's essentially how far you want the blade sticking out, how far you need it to go into whatever material it is that you're cutting. So if you're cutting paper, it'll typically be on the lighter side of the scale. If you're cutting a thicker material, like let's say leather, then you would generally need it on the higher end of the scale, near about around number 10, because the material itself is a lot thicker. The speed, obviously, is how fast the Cameo cuts. A lot of materials are okay with a very high speed. Some materials prefer a lower speed because it'll rip up or it needs time to actually cut through. So when you're cutting things like vinyl, you can typically go with a slightly higher speed. If you're cutting paper, it prefers a slightly lower speed. And if you're cutting again something like leather, you need the speed on 1 because it needs to go very slowly. Force means how much pressure it exerts onto the blade. So how much it's actually going to try and pull through the material. If you have a very thick material, you would want a very high force. If you have a very thin and easily tearable material, so it's got a very low tensile strength, then you would typically need a lower force. You wouldn't need a very high force on that. Passes are how many times it'll do the same cut over and over again. Most things you only need 1. If you don't want to have a very high force, or if you can't have a very high force on the material, then typically you would need to up the passes on that material. The next section is where you have what it looks like a little teepee. It's called the overcut. Now what this does is it will drop the blade a fraction of a millimeter before the cut needs to start, and it'll lift the blade up a fraction of a millimeter after the cut has been completed. These settings you can actually change here in the line segment overcut. So mine's gone on 0.2 millimeters. So what it'll do is it'll start 0.2 millimeters above the letter and it'll end 0.2 millimeters after the cut line. This also makes your silhouette a lot noisier because it'll lift it up and then it'll put it down and then it'll lift it up and put it down, so it'll go tick, 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 tick. So a lot of people don't like it for that reason, but it's fantastic for many intricate cuts. Track enhancing is something you only really need to use if you're using multiple passes on your machine, because what it'll do is it'll feed the mat through the Cameo multiple times to make sure that it has the correct track. I've, to be honest, never used this feature. I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing, but oh well. So obviously they're set on, the standard was what I last used, which was vinyl glossy. And then when it comes to picking out a starting point for your test cut. You have to think of the material that you're using. As an example, this material that I have is an adhesive vinyl. It's quite a foily type vinyl. It's quite a thick one. So we want to choose a starting point that is something similar to the settings in Silhouette. So let's take a look here. We've got cardstock, adhesive backed. No, that would be too thick. So let's go to vinyl. So vinyl metallic would probably be a very good starting point for what we have. You could apply exactly everything that I'm doing now to whatever it is that you're using. So if you have paper, they have a paper setting that you can start with, and use that as a starting point for your vinyl or for your machine, because most machines will cut on the standard settings, but every now and then maybe your blade is a little bit more dull. I know that my blade's a little bit finicky sometimes and it doesn't work on the standard settings, so I kind of have to use test cuts very often to get settings right for my machine and my blade. So I'm just going to cut off a small section of the paper, and then what I normally do is I load my strip. So I've now got a 5 centimeter section that I'm going to load onto my mat. Now I have the material that I want to cut loaded onto my mat. I'm going to do what I normally do with when I have sections of material loaded onto my mat, and I'm going to reduce the page size. So we go back to the main panel and we change the height to 5 centimeters, and the width I'm going to leave as 30.48. So now at least I know what area I have to work with, and I'm not going to overcut things on my mat. We'll start on the standard settings, adjusting the test cuts as we go along. Now let's send this one to the Cameo to cut. So I'm going to unload this before testing the cut, because obviously that's exactly what we want to do. We want to take a closer look at the cut settings. So I'm going to unload the mat and take a closer look. Okay, this one did cut well, but we can see that there's actually a little bit of a cut line on the paper. So that means that the pressure is probably too high on this one, and we need to lower it a bit. Because what can happen if you leave it like this is you will get the backing lifting up with the vinyl as well, which you don't want, because that'll make it even more difficult to weed. So we load our mat straight back into the Cameo, just as it is. So with this material, as we've just seen it now in our first test cut, the force was potentially a little bit too high. So what we can do is we can lower the force a little bit, and we can possibly even increase the speed. Blade depth was perfect. An easy way to tell if the blade depth is not correct is if you, as an example with the vinyl, if you pull the vinyl off and you can't see any indentations on the back. If you can't see any indentations on the back, you know that you need to increase your blade depth. But if you can see indentations on the back from where it's essentially scored the material, then you probably just need to increase the force. So here we've decreased the force a little bit. Now, obviously we can't cut in the same place because it has now been removed already, it's cut already. So what you can do is one of two things. You can either just manually move it across, or you can duplicate it and then switch off the cut lines. I prefer to just move it because you can just move it further along, or you can move it underneath. That'll also work fine. So let's try underneath, so we can just cut off the end of the material and not waste too much material. All right, so we can see the cut there. It looks good. Let's pull that up. Came off beautifully. That also came off beautifully. And we can see there how there's not as much of an indentation. So let's pull up this part of the P. So if you compare the two, you can't see as much of the lines of the P. There is what here is what you can at the top. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set that to no cut, just so that I know where it is on the page. And I actually want to cut a name label for a water bottle. let's send this to cut with our new settings. I might even put the force down 1 just to see how it handles. Right, let's see how it worked. Beautiful. So there we have a beautiful cut that we can now weed. So what I will do now is I will save these cut settings as a new one, so that I can make sure that next time I use this vinyl, I have the settings already saved. So we go to the materials, add new material type, rename materials, so I'll make it holographic adhesive. And we had a blade depth of 2, speed of 5, a force of 11, and we had the overcut on. The overcut was on 0.2, but so we'll just change it back to that, 0.2. Then I save my settings. And we can close this material settings panel. And the next time I want to use them, I just go to holographic adhesive, and there my settings are already saved. Well, thanks very much for watching. I hope that this really helped you along your journey to getting the perfect cut on any material, because all of these principles that I've explained today will help you whether you're using leather, normal paper, cardstock, vinyl, heat transfer, whatever the case may be. If you apply everything that I've gone over today, you will get the perfect cuts and you won't waste meters and meters of vinyl in the process. So rather take a minute or 2 out when you get a new vinyl or a new material, do 1 or 2 test cuts just to see what that material is. Save the material in your Silhouette Studio so that you have it there for future use. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more of my videos in the future, hit that subscribe button. It helps the YouTube algorithms show you more of what you might want. And it helps me to bring you more content in the future. You can subscribe to my channel on this side. On that side, YouTube will show you my latest video, and below that, YouTube will show you something that it thinks that you'll enjoy. And remember, be kind to someone today. See you next time!